The school-to-prison pipeline is an over-reliance on punitive school discipline policies, pushing children out of education and into the criminal justice system. And more on the HSBC money laundering scandal. How much did big banks help Mexico's drug gangs expand? Watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. For the first time, a U.S. congressional panel is looking into what the American Civil Liberties Union calls a disturbing trend, and one which criminalizes rather than educates many U.S. children. The so-called school-to-prison pipeline has been linked to zero-tolerance policies that remove teachers' discretion on how to discipline student misbehavior. School-based arrests, disciplinary alternative schools, and secured detention are also being blamed. Campaigners say the policy has seen children suspended for minor infractions, marginalizing at-risk youth and denying them access to education. They say it all leaves them more likely to end up in prison as adults. What's more, the burden of the trend falls disproportionately on students of color. Well, Edward Ward is a youth worker from Chicago who was testifying about the school-to-prison pipeline in Congress. I caught up with him before he went in. So talk to me about the school-to-prison pipeline. How have you seen this sort of manifest itself? You've really seen it at the front lines, haven't you?
Yes. I've actually seen where in schools they treat the students like prisoners. And when you treat students like prisoners or criminals, you don't get results, you get consequences. And so as a result of the students constantly being treated like criminals, their voices are not being heard. They're being suspended for minor infractions, such as not wearing the proper identification around their necks. When they come to school late, they're being placed in these detention centers where it seems like it's solitary confinement, where if you talk wrong or if you say anything, then you get suspended. If your phone rings and it's heard, you get suspended. If you put in headphones, you get suspended. And they send you to these detention centers, or the detention room, and they don't give you any work to do. You miss out on your class time. And we were on block schedules, so they missed about 90 minutes worth of class time.
Now, why would something like this be happening in a school setting? This doesn't sound like education.
I guess the crazy thing about it is one of their main reasons or motives were that we're going to teach students respect. And it was more so they weren't teaching respect, but they were, oppressing the students into respecting the adults. Whereas if a student wants to speak his or her mind, if they want to express themselves, they were basically saying school was not the place to do that. But they've completely ignored every issue or problem that the students faced outside of school.
Now, you're from Chicago. Is this something that's just happening in Chicago, or is this something that's happening all across the United States? Which students are being impacted?
I think it's happening more so across the country, because I work with Dignity in Schools. It's a national coalition, and so we work with students all across the country who are facing some of the similar issues.
And is it students of color who are being impacted? Is it white students? Who are the students that are facing these, I think they're sometimes called zero-tolerance policies?
Yes, I would say I believe that it's students everywhere, but more so it's more consistent among students of color. But research shows that students of color are being suspended more frequently than white students for minor infractions.
Is there more pressure on these students, or rather the schools, to perform, and maybe that's the reason for some of these zero-tolerance policies? For example, the No Child Left Behind Act has certainly put a lot of pressure on teachers and administrators to make sure that students succeed. Is that a contributing factor here?
I think it is, but I think that as far as due to the pressure that they're going about it the wrong way. Because if you want students to succeed, you have to give them the chance to succeed. Wherefore, if you suspend them or expel them, then you're basically dismantling their future.
So what needs to be done? Why is this sort of being allowed to continue?
I think it's been allowed to continue because there's not enough pressure on the public school system. And what needs to be done is we need to offer more positive approaches to discipline. We need to offer more positive approaches to deal with the situations that they face outside of school within their own communities.
But if this is an issue of discipline, don't the high-performing students deserve to be learning in a setting free from distractions of children that may be causing trouble?
But see, I mean, a lot of people would argue that. I was a high-performing student, and it bothers me more to see that students are actually ignored, to see that students are being put to the streets, treated like criminals. That's why I got involved, to change something, to change the system.
So bottom line, you're on Capitol Hill. What are you going to tell lawmakers? What message do you want them to hear?
I want them to hear that you don't shut up the voices of the students. You have to speak with the students, understand their current situations. Stop putting them out of school. Don't suspend them. Don't detain them for minor infractions. You want to kind of build a better relationship with the community. You want to implement like restorative justice practices or other best practices in the schools that would help to rebuild a sense of community. Because if you have a good community, then you have a good school.
So is there a school-to-prison pipeline in the United States? With me to discuss this from New York is Dennis Parker, the director of the Racial Justice Program at the American Civil Liberties Union. And joining me from Baltimore is Hubert Williams, the former president of the Police Foundation. So, Mr. Parker, I want to start with you. Talk to me a little bit about the factors that are contributing to these school-to-prison pipelines.
Well, there are a lot of factors, and some of them go back to zero-tolerance policies that were originally put in place to address the fear of gun violence and drugs, and gradually spread so that kids were being kicked out of school basically for a wide range of violations. The increase in the suspension rates, which pushed kids out of school for increasingly long periods of time. There are a lot of different factors, but the bottom line is they add up to a large number of students who are being either kicked out of school or sent to the criminal justice system for the types of things that used to be dealt with in the schools themselves by the principals or by guidance counselors. And so we're concerned that as more kids get kicked out of school, fewer kids graduate, and more of those kids will eventually end up in the criminal justice system.
And talk to me a little bit about that system that they find themselves in, Mr. Williams. I mean, what is it like for children when they find themselves suddenly in juvenile detention?
Well, it's not a good experience for them, obviously. But this is more complicated than it appears because you have multiple agencies with different types of jurisdiction that impact on the child. The police have nothing to do with the system's decision about whether or not to retain or dismiss a student. This focus of zero tolerance needs to be more explicitly and clearly explained. Is it the view that the police, when they see young kids in the street, that they arrest them, any of them? Or is it the view that's being argued here that these kids are being pushed out of the school system into the street, and they end up getting into violations of the law, and the police arrest them? Now, if it's the latter case, we expect the police to discharge their duties and responsibilities consistent with the law. And they do have discretion, but it's limited amount of discretion.
And so, it seems that it's often relatively minor infractions. I mean, talk to me about some of the things that children are being pulled out of school and into the criminal justice system for.
Well, I think what I'd like to hear, stated, because I'm questioning some of these issues as well, is what are they kicking the kids out of school for? Is it because they fail to pass certain grade levels? They're not interested in the school, they're troublemakers, etc.
Well, maybe, Mr. Parker, you can speak to this a little bit, because I think that you've also done research on some of the infractions that children are finding themselves being disciplined for.
We have. We've done research and we've brought cases across the country. And again, what we're seeing is that kids are being kicked out for very minor offenses very often.
Like what? Talk to me about some of these offenses.
For instance, under some zero tolerance programs, there was a case where a child was kicked out for having a very small 1 or a 2-inch, obviously fake plastic gun. There are kids who have been arrested in New York City for writing on a desk. And you know, obviously, we don't want to encourage writing on the desk, but it's not an arrestable offense. The other thing that we see very often is that the problem starts with something that is clearly not a violation of the law and then escalates, so that a child talks back to a police officer or a school resource officer, it escalates, and that child is ultimately charged with resisting arrest, even though there was really no basis for the police officer to intervene. So for example, we've seen cases where some kid is violating the school dress code. A police officer or a school resource officer will question them, and that escalates into ultimately the kid being handcuffed. So there are a whole range of things that, again, as I said before, years ago would have been dealt with by the principal. And now
I just want to take a look at some of the kids that are finding themselves being dealt with by police versus the principal. In fact, let's look at students who are most at risk. The U.S. Department of Education looked at 72,000 schools in 7,000 districts, representing about 85% of U.S. schools, and data shows that students of color tend to receive much harsher discipline than white students. African American students represented 18% of students in the sample, but accounted for 39% of expulsions. For students whose, quote, disciplinary issues involve police calls, 70% are Latino or Black. And students with disabilities are also subjected to harsh discipline. They are twice as likely as non-disabled students to receive suspensions. Children with disabilities make up only 12% of students sampled, but represent 70% of students subjected to physical restraints like being strapped down. I mean, perhaps you can explain to us, Mr. Parker, exactly how young are some of the children that are finding themselves being put in these types of restraints for writing on a school desk or some other type of minor infraction?
The first of the very famous cases involved a 5 or 6 year old girl who was having a temper tantrum, as some 5 or 6 year olds do. A police officer was called in and she was handcuffed. And there have been similar incidents. That was in Florida, but it's been repeated throughout the country. So it can start at the very earliest ages. And you have to ask yourself, what is that child's experience going to be of school, of interactions with police officers, with her sense of herself? So it starts at very early ages and continues up.
And Mr. Williams, maybe you can speak to the fact of these sort of zero tolerance policies that you talked about. Do they make schools safer?
Let me first address the issue that's been raised related to children being arrested 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old by the police. And let me say explicitly that there has to be a mens rea, an element of intent for the commission of a crime that a child that's 7 years old is not capable of having. So the police should never, the criminal justice system should not be used with kids. It's not intended for that purpose. And I think sometimes, and on rare occasions, I believe also that you might have a police officer to react that way. But it's not appropriate for the police to arrest children, to handcuff them if they are below the age of 7 years old.
So Mr. Williams, what needs to be done then if this is what is happening, and it seems statistics are showing that, and there are reports of that? What needs to be done to make sure that police are used effectively and not sort of being used to resolve issues that should be resolved by a school guidance counselor and administrator?
First thing is that the police really do not have the time nor the ability to deal with these minor infractions of the law. And I think that police chiefs know this and understand this. And you need to have some dialogue with the leadership in the police department to find out what's necessitating or prompting the police department or police officer, probably individually, to act in this way. Because the police don't have the time. There are 218,000 people in a federal prison right now. The police are being inundated with complaints about violence, about serious criminal offenses. They don't have the time or the ability to go after children and deal with laws related to young people. And so I would think that you would have some dialogue and discussion between people that are responsible within the school system, within the police department, to address these issues. Secondly, let me say this, that we have in policing in America right now the idea of community-oriented policing. The police, and this is a tremendous transition from the way the police function in past years.
But maybe I can get Mr. Parker to jump in here for a second too, because is community policing the way to resolve what you seem to portray as a nationwide problem in the United States?
We have been recommending two very important things. One is that police officers be trained. Very often in some school districts we found that police officers have not gotten specific training on dealing with children, on child psychology. The second thing is that there has to be a clear understanding between the school district and the police officers or the school resource officers about what it is they are to do, who is in charge, who is to decide, so that it has to be made clear in a memorandum of understanding or some kind of written policy that says you do not have the authority to intervene for something that is not a criminal offense. So I think that that's the starting point.
And what happens in the interim? I mean, if this is not the case and action is not taken, what is happening to these children ultimately? Are they facing sort of a lifetime of incarceration? Does this set them on the wrong path? And if this is not turned around, what is going to happen to these children?
Well, the statistics show that there's a correlation between dropout rates and suspension and expulsion rates. So that the kids who are involved in the system either are kicked out of school or are sent to the juvenile justice system are far more likely to drop out. And the statistics also show that if you look at the percentage of dropouts who end up in the correction system, it's shocking. And for particularly African American males, something like 2/3 of black male dropouts can expect to be in prison by the time they're 35.
All right, Mr. Parker and Hubert Williams, or Dennis Parker that is, and Hubert Williams, we do appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.
And now more on the HSBC money laundering scandal and just how that helped Mexico's booming drug cartels. On Tuesday, the bank agreed to a settlement of $1.9 billion, a record amount, but still a drop in the ocean in terms of HSBC's worth. But it also emerged that between 2002 and 2009, HSBC had classified Mexico as the lowest risk in its money laundering rankings, allowing cartels to escape reviews of cash transfers. In all, it's thought hundreds of millions of dollars from Mexican drug gangs, and especially the Sinaloa cartel, was allowed to flow into the U.S. even though the bank had the resources to limit the risk. And it's not the only bank that had helped the cartels. In 2010, the U.S. bank Wachovia was sanctioned for failing to properly monitor more than $378 billion worth of exchange cash from Mexico. Well, Peter Walt is the author of Drug War Mexico and is investigating the role of the financial industry in the rise of Mexico's cartels. I asked him how HSBC became the preferred bank for the drug gangs.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Earlier, at the beginning of the century, this century, HSBC buys up a Mexican bank, Banco Vital. Even though Banco Vital has issues with money laundering, and Mexico is rated by the American organization Global Financial Integrity as one of the highest risk countries for money laundering, for illicit flows of cash. The first one is China, second place is Mexico, and third place is Russia. So even despite the fact that there are signals that the banking industry in Mexico is compromised by its relationship with organized crime, HSBC nonetheless moves into Mexico and buys a bank and sets up an organization there.
So are you suggesting it was quite a sort of a calculated process? This was certainly not accidental? Is that what you're telling us?
The senior executives at HSBC are being warned by anti-money laundering controllers within the company that there are serious issues here. Those warnings get passed up to the top and they're either ignored, or in some cases the whistleblowers like Carolyn Wind, Wyndham Clark and John Cruz eventually get fired. There are serious problems with this because Mexico is a high-risk country with high-risk clients, and yet the senior management within the company seems to be ignoring these things. It treats Mexico as a low-risk country.
We're hearing about HSBC in the headlines, but you've been covering money laundering for some time. I mean, how prevalent or how widespread is this?
My sense is that it's much more widespread, and that HSBC in a way is the tip of the iceberg. You may recall that just a couple of years ago, Wachovia, which is part of the Wells Fargo group, also received a fine for the same reason, because it was processing and laundering money on behalf of for example, the Sinaloa cartel, which is probably one of the biggest drug trafficking organizations in the world. The money was going through casas de cambio in Puebla. Casas de cambio are like bureau de change, or places where you do wire transfers. So the investigation found that Wachovia did not apply anti-money laundering controls to $378 billion. That's equivalent to a third of Mexico's gross domestic product. The other banks have been accused by the US financial authorities. They include Citibank, Bank of America, the Spanish bank, Banco Santander. They've all been accused of these things and investigated to some extent as well. So yes, it's HSBC, and yes, it's Wachovia. Those are the ones that we definitely know about, but there are indications that it could be much more widespread than we know.
And how did the global financial crisis play into this, if it does at all?
The banks, because of the crisis, they need liquid assets, and here come along these organized crime syndicates, and they're giving the banks cash, essentially. It gives the banks, it props them up, and it gives them liquid assets. You know, I spoke to one former financial crime investigator from Scotland Yard a few weeks ago, and he suggested to me that really no Western governments are going to clamp down on this, because the banks need those assets. Otherwise, you know, they're going to go under, they're going to fail, and they're going to enter more periods of crisis and so on and so forth. So in some cases the banks are, you know, looking the other way. In some cases they're actively seeking out hot money.
And I guess one thing that I'm wondering too is, how much is there a correlation between the spike in drug violence that we've seen and the money laundering that's taken place? I mean, did this allow the drug cartels to essentially expand?
You know, the government in Mexico just produced figures in August this year that suggest that there have been about 100,000 murders between 2007 and 2011, with 27,000 homicides in 2011 alone. That's 3 every hour, or 1 every 20 minutes, however you want to look at it. But so the violence has become, has got to a level which is quite unprecedented. But, you know, drug trafficking organizations they're very good capitalists, and what this is about the bottom line. It's about money, it's about profits. So the only way that the Mexican government and the US government can really address this, if they're serious about it, they need to start by dismantling the system that allows money laundering, or the laundering of these proceeds from the blood money, essentially, from organized crime. They need to clamp down on that, and they need to dismantle that system. They need to start in the City of London, they need to start in Manhattan, they need to start in Miami, they need to start in the Cayman Islands, because that's essentially the structure of organized crime.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for that. I appreciate all of those insights. Thank you.
No problem.
Well, that is all from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Thanks for watching Inside Story. And a reminder, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. We want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us here at Inside Story at aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.